Welcome to another episode of The Agenda. Today we have as our guest Professor Srinath Raghavan, Senior Fellow at Center for Policy Research. He specializes in contemporary and historical aspects of India's foreign and security policies. He's a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and is a Professor of International Relations at Ashoka University. Welcome, Professor.
Delighted to be here.
Professor, we begin by discussing China because that has been one of the recent incidents and that's been of prime importance. So, and what we've discussed a lot in the past, what the media has also covered, is what happened and how it happened. But what has not been discussed as much is why it happened or what the root causes were. So two explanations that have been given or many commentators have put forward are that one, China has come of age. It's reached a certain economic maturity, it's reached a certain security level, military apparatus maturity in sort of its growth as a regional power, that it now wants to flex some muscle around, especially in its neighborhood where it believes India has had some sort of dominant role to play in the past. Or secondly, perhaps these are just old territorial disputes which were bound to come sometime or the other. So which of these two would be a more plausible explanation for China's actions, or could there be a third possible, another explanation?
Well, if you want to sort of understand why this particular incident or standoff at this Doklam plateau happened, then I think you need both, right? Because yes, there is a longer term sort of territorial dynamic to what exactly happened in that particular area. And that is surrounding the fact that Bhutan and China have disputed that particular area, which is the so-called Doklam Plateau. It is one of the three sort of disputed areas between Bhutan and China. The Chinese have asserted their control over that territory, or whatever their claims to that territory by carrying out periodic patrolling. They have a dirt track already sort of in that area, and so on. So what is happening really is an attempt by them to build a blacktop road in that area, which would mean a significant enhancement in their ability to physically control or take control of that territory if they want to. Right? Doesn't mean that they want to, but nevertheless gives them the option. So there is clearly a sort of a long-standing territorial dynamic story to it. I think the reason you need to sort of bring in the other angle of China's sort of rising power and so on is because that is important to understand the timing of it, right? Why now as opposed to say 5 years ago? The Chinese would have done it at any point of time. And there I think some of the sort of other points which have been made, which is to say that clearly there's a newfound confidence in China's foreign policy. They believe that they cannot let other countries sort of limit them out of territorial disputes. They want to sort of take a strong stance. All of that in some ways helps us to understand why it happened at this particular point of time, right? Because just to reiterate that building a blacktop road in an area which is about 14,000 feet above sea level is very different from building a blacktop road in any plain, right? Because it represents a change in the status quo of a very different magnitude. And I think that for the Chinese to have attempted something like that could not have been a very light decision. I mean, they must have thought hard about it and decided that the time was suitable enough for them to be able to push the envelope in that direction.
Okay. So, if you're looking at the optionality of Chinese foreign policy, what has happened even more recently is the opening of the highway which connects Tibet to Nepal. And that gives the Chinese a similar optionality in the region, a bit north. And how would that play out? Because we don't see Nepal having the sort of relations that Bhutan has with India. And at the same time, the region is very different. I mean, India could have had some sort of advantage in Bhutanese territory near Doklam. But at the same time, could we see that same strategic and as well as foreign policy advantage playing towards India? Because that seems less likely in the case of Nepal and China expanding in that region.
So I think there are a couple of things here which we just need to disentangle. Right? So the first point is about Chinese sort of building communication links with Nepal. They have a road, they have a plan for a railway network connecting Tibet and Nepal, which is all sort of going to come on stream at some point. And all of that is basically an attempt by the Chinese to improve their sort of connectivity links with the Southern Asian region, right? So there is a certain straightforward dynamic to that. It has got to do with trade, movement of goods, people, etc., which they want to be able to promote in these particular parts, right? The second is this whole sort of question of what does it mean for Indian foreign policy that the Chinese are doing these kinds of things, right? Now, there I think it's fair to say that China has, over the last decade and a half, developed pretty close ties with most of India's neighbors in economic terms, in terms of connectivity and so on, right? And many of India's neighbors also have sort of welcomed Chinese presence one way or the other. Partly because they see it as a way of offsetting India's own dominance within South Asia, right? Pakistan was the first country to do it. They did it as far back as 1962. And pretty much every other country has followed suit since. And, with Nepal, that dynamic is very clearly in place. Now, what does it mean for India? I think what it means for India is that, we cannot simply take our neighbors for granted. We cannot assume that just because geographically and in certain other sort of, parameters we have a preponderance in this region means that our grid is going to run everywhere, right? So in a sense, translating your assets into influence, it requires careful policies and, ability to do things, which we cannot take for granted. And I think that's true of Sri Lanka, that's true of Bangladesh, that is true of pretty much every country that neighbors India. But as you said, the singular exception of Bhutan, partly because, we can sort of more or less control Bhutan's foreign policy. But even that is changing, right? I mean, if you look at, say, the terms of the treaty which was signed in 1949, when the Chinese were just coming into Tibet and so on, and the 2007 revision of that treaty, there are changes. And as Bhutan becomes more democratic, as Bhutanese domestic politics sort of becomes gets more salience, Bhutan will want to play a more independent role. So at some point of time or the other, that status quo is also going to change.
Professor, now that status will change because China has a certain amount of economic clout that India can only aspire to, at least for the moment. And apart from being the sort of military power, the strongest military power in the region, at least in Asia, India lacks, China has that status, but India also lacks the sort of economic clout that China has directly, because it has better reserves, it has more money, essentially, and it can give that money as aid or as investment or building infrastructure in India's neighborhood. But at the same time, China has also been increasing its economic clout through institutions such as the AAIB, and at the same time, the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. Yeah. India is on board with these kind of things, but at the same time, China has, at least with the AAIB, China is at the forefront.
That's right.
And China has been using the sort of clout not just in India's neighborhood, but also at the same time in Africa. And India lacks the sort of resources to combat something like this. So what are India's options to deal with something like this? Because on a military level, we're anyway far behind. India at the same time is far behind on the economic level. So what should be the ideal response to something like this?
Well, in the first instance, I don't think the story is simply about macro level economic balances between India and China. Right? Obviously, the Chinese economy is much larger. They have more reserves. They have some. But I think the issue is more to do with the fact that the Chinese have managed not just to finance but actually execute projects in our neighborhood, which has given them a sort of a credibility that, frankly, India lacks. Because if you look at pretty much many of the major infrastructure projects that we have undertaken in our neighborhood over the last 10 years or so, most of them are running over time. Again, it's not as if Indian infrastructure companies are not capable of doing that stuff. I think where we lack is the ability of our system to bring together foreign policy concerns with a micro level understanding of how project management happens and an ability to sort of pull these different elements together. And that's where I think we've really been lagging in the game, so to speak. Because you take a country like Afghanistan, I think India has given more aid to Afghanistan in dollar for dollar terms than the Chinese have. So it's certainly not the case that the requirements in our neighborhood are such that a country like India cannot step up and meet them. I think it's more about translating that kind of economic muscle into actual tangible gains on the ground. And so long as we're not able to do that stuff, the Chinese are going to beat us in our own neighborhood, for certain.
Professor, when we're talking about commercial diplomacy, to what extent, fine, we have to focus on specific areas as we focused on Afghanistan, but to what extent can this work with China, where we have huge amounts of trade? We have a huge trade deficit with China. We're importing a lot. And hopefully, as China's income levels rise in the foreseeable future, hopefully at some point Indian companies will also be exporting to China. And how should that play out? And specifically, we've seen in the past that especially the United States has used the private sector and has used individuals from the private sector and gotten them into government to deal with specific countries that they have strong relations with. So we saw Hank Paulson, who was an expert in China, who had strong ties with the Chinese, and that somehow helped the Americans during the 2008 financial crisis when he was Secretary of the Treasury. Now we see Donald Trump appointing Rex Tillerson, who's perhaps the closest Westerner in that sense, or a Western corporate head with the Russians,
yeah.
and he's the foreign secretary, the secretary of the state at this point.
That's right.
So, can India use maybe the commercial side of diplomacy to its advantage, especially in dealing with China? Do you think that's possible?
Well, again, I think there are two different questions there, so let me just try and answer them one by one. The first question is about, how do you address your trade deficit with China, which is obviously creating a very lopsided economic relationship, right? Now, in theory, there are only two ways of addressing any trade deficit. Either India gets to export more, and the reason we are not able to export more is frankly because our companies are not getting market access in China, and this is true for many of our information technology companies, for pharma, even for things like simple agricultural commodity exports, like basmati rice exports and such like things, right? So which do constitute a significant part of India's export in the in the immediate sort of neighborhood, so to speak. And the reason that is not happening is clearly it is now clear we have tried, multiple Chinese governments have sort of given assurances saying they're going to look into this, but on the ground things have not moved, right? So it's clearly a market access, non-tariff barrier story, straightforward out there. And there are only two ways of, there's only one way of dealing with that non-tariff barrier story, which is that, unless you are in a position to create reciprocal non-tariff barriers for the Chinese out here, that message is not going to go down. And I don't think we have quite done that, right? I mean, we've taken them to WTO quite a bit. There are private groups in India who want to boycott of Chinese goods, but that's a drop in the ocean for the Chinese, right? That's not really going to help. We need a more systematic policy of telling the Chinese that there has to be a calibration on both sides. The second way in which you can deal with a deficit on your balance of trade is to have a greater inflow on the capital account, right? Which means greater Chinese investments into India. Now, that is what was originally expected when the Modi government came to power, and that really was the line that they were taking. But because India also needed investments, there was a sort of flagging private investment story within India. So foreign direct investment is seen as some way of sort of, at least, if not offsetting it, at least giving a spur to the animal spirits of Indian capital, so to speak. But the fact is that the political dynamic between the two countries is sort of soured a little bit ever since, and that has meant in some ways that the investment story is not working. And let's also bear in mind that the investment story is not one simply of the Chinese saying that we are just going to sort of invest so much into India. You also have to create conditions in India which will be attractive for Chinese investment. I think that the capital is the same everywhere, right? So whatever be the political sort of calculations, certain basic economic conditions have to be, and I don't think the Chinese have felt that that's been quite the case. So the story about how you bridge the trade deficit therefore is wrong. The second thing is of saying that the private sector and such like it. And there I think the United States is not really a very good model for anyone, right? Because the United States is the world's largest economy. They're a sort of technological hub. They are an innovation powerhouse. For the United States, the challenge always is to sort of get access to markets. It's not about getting access to capital or ideas and so on, right? So their story is quite different, and they bring very different kinds of systems. The government system is also very different, right? It's always been a system which is much more open to private sector participation. It's not quite clear to me, which are the companies in India which will be able to do very much with the Chinese. You could think about certain things, right? For instance, there are Indian corporations which have struck these very large deals with the Chinese for worth $8-10 billion for import of power generation equipment. The question for us is whether we are in a position to be able to anticipate those kinds of deals and then build it into our foreign policy to say that can we leverage some of that in the way that we deal with China. But the fact is that at this point, I don't think our system is quite geared up to be able to do that yet.
So we might not be geared up at the moment, right? But we can hope that at a certain point we can at least match the way China looks at these things. So we have seen that state corporations or state companies in China have a lot of clout because I mean they have direct access to the government. I mean they're owned by the government, and that's why the sort of economic clout that China can buy, in that sense of the term, in the neighborhood is, and also in investments, in mutual investments that are planned for India, is a lot more that Indian private companies have been able to. I mean that requires some sort of help from the government, certainly, opening up talks with other countries in the region as well, general support for export. But that's just the economic side of things. Apart from the economic side of things, and also if you take into account the security challenges, to what extent does political leadership have a role to play? Is it ceding control and giving more autonomy to the officials and to the military, or in this case, let's say, business houses? What is the ideal response from political leadership, and what sort of role does it play in determining our foreign policy in relations with China, security and economic?
In the office of the Prime Minister, right? I mean, starting with Jawaharlal Nehru, who was his own foreign minister for 17 years, that really has been the pattern. You'd be hard pressed to think about any sustained period of time where you had either a foreign or a defense minister who, in some ways, is able to sort of, pull his weight against the sort of wish of the Prime Minister. So, in that sense, I don't think our problem is that of centralization or decentralization. Right? Foreign and security policy have historically been quite centralized in the scheme of things in the government of India. So, I don't think that per se is an issue. The question for us is whether we have the systems in place which are able to break up the natural way in which not just our government but most governments do business, which is to do it through their particular departments, through their particular silos, looking at particular bureaucratic interests, right? And whether we are able to sort of take a much more whole of government kind of approach which is there. And that, frankly, even if you speak to most senior practitioners, has always been a challenge. And I'm sure it's a challenge for every government. But in the case of the Indian government, it's particularly challenging because of the certain kinds of models that we have adopted of how the government does its business. What does it mean to sort of get someone to coordinate between 3 or 4 different ministries? So all of that is, which is where precisely what I was telling you earlier as well, right? I mean, for instance, if you look at India's inability so far to deliver on serious infrastructure projects in our neighborhoods, I don't think it's a problem just of financing or even of technical capability on the Indian side. It is about whether our system can bring all of these stakeholders together and actually deliver something. Even within the government, if you notice, I mean, if you look at big success stories, say, in terms of technological innovation in India, they have happened in agencies like the ISRO or the nuclear program, right? Which are all highly centralized project mode kind of stuff, right? Where integration of different capabilities happens in a very systematic way. In most other cases, it's not. So I think that really is one of our main challenges when we look into the next 2-3 decades, is that as your economic power grows, as your global profile grows, if you really want to be able to translate any of that into concrete outcomes for yourself, then you need to have that kind of institutional muscle, which is quite different from just saying that the size of the government is large, we have good people in there.
So, provided we get that institutional muscle, we get enough economic power, and we translate that into hard power at a certain point. But by the time we get there, what should be the approach that Indian policymakers take with respect to China? Should bandwagoning be considered an option? Should aligning with the United States be considered an option? Should India be looking at getting the smaller regional powers together up against China? What should be the option that, up until that point at least, that Indian policymakers should be taking?
Well, I think in some ways Indian policymakers should look at what the Chinese did when they were in a similar situation with the United States, right? To go back to Deng Xiaoping's famous dictum, you keep your head down, bide your time, build up your capabilities. I think that in some ways is the best advice for India as well, which is to say that at this point of time, your main challenges, frankly, are all domestic, right? It is to do with your economic growth. It is to do with the kind of social transformation that is going to come with that kind of economic growth. It is about, finding high quality or quality employment for the million or so people who are coming into your labor markets every month. And frankly, unless and until you can tackle these challenges, there is just no question of India being able to do anything at the global stage, because it's just going to be completely hemmed in by And in some ways, the real story at the international stage for us is how do we leverage international sort of relationships in order to affect this domestic transition, right? So that's where I'd say that I think at this point of time, the requirement is the other way around. You want to sort of leverage external abilities to do this, right? So in that context, China has both things to offer you in a sense of given that they are a country with which is one potential source of investment, various kinds of things, market access. That's part of it is certainly there. But at the same time, you would want to manage the security relationship with China in such a way that it does not land you in conflictual situations with them. Because frankly, a conflict with China is definitely not going to be in India's interest in any conceivable scenario, right? And even if we manage to sort of end in some kind of a stalemate, frankly, that stalemate will hurt us more simply because of the disparity of power between both sides, right? I mean, that's just a fact of life, so to speak. So in this context, what are the options? The options, as you're saying, yes, can we, typically you think of it in terms of bandwagoning or you want to balance, right? The question is, can you sort of bandwagon with China? I think that's going to be quite difficult for any Indian political leader to do. And even if you look at, say, India's response to this Belt and Road Initiative and so on, right? One of the things that, we wanted to sort of send a message out was that, we are not sort of going to accept China's de facto leadership if they do not take other countries into consideration and treat them as equals, right? So we don't want an unequal relationship with China. So I think that certainly is out of the question. When it comes to balancing, again, you can balance in many ways, right? You can balance by sort of finding stronger external partners. The United States is obviously an example. I think the logic, at least one of the strong logics of US-India relations since, say, 2004 and the way that they've developed is definitely their mutual concerns for China. Again, this is not to say that it's the same kind of a relationship that you're aiming at as one of containment or something like that. But definitely, the desire to sort of make sure that the Chinese are not unilaterally able to rewrite rules of the game in Asia, at least, is a common sort of concern for both India and the United States. The same is the case with the kind of relationships you're building with countries like Japan, potentially Vietnam, Australia, and so on. Right? All of these are what you might call as countervailing sort of coalitions that you want to build to make sure that the Chinese are there. But the danger there again is that the extent to which all of that also enmeshes you in issues and problems which you do not have a direct stake in, where other countries might have stakes with China, right? Because at that point in time you cannot back off and say that it's. So my own view is frankly that that the dichotomy between balancing and bandwagoning is somewhat mistaken. If you look at historically. A lot of states, especially if you look at, say, 19th century Europe, the classic sort of setting of international politics, states have, signed pacts with each other simply to restrain each other from, going to war, right? Restraining pacts are actually one of the most common types of pacts. The technical term for them is pacta de contendo. And, restraining alliances were very common in the 19th century. The idea that alliances are only for aggregation of power is a very 20th century idea. And it's funny enough, not one that independent India really bought into. The idea of non-alignment was pretty much that we do not believe that the options are only bandwagoning and balancing and so on. And I think that idea remains important to India today, which is to say that in the longer run, the real strength to India is from internal balancing. It cannot come from external balancing because it's inconceivable that India will enter into sort of NATO-type alliances with countries and so on. But at the same time, you need to make sure that your sort of capacity for making independent decisions, judgments, executing actions, and asserting your power grows over a period of time, right? So in that context, I think looking at something like a restraining understanding with China, which is to come to an understanding saying, listen, for both India and China, the key issues today are domestic economic social transformations, and that at this point of time, it simply does not make sense for us to get enmeshed into competition either over minor territorial disputes or over status goals like NSC membership or China's sort of AIIB and so on.